good they came in here. And that wasn't recorded at all, so nobody knows. So we're here for my talk on from user stories to use cases, tell the full story. This is a session I gave at DrupalCon. It was a shorter session there because they had like the 30-minute ones. This is longer, but at the same time, I'd like to kind of still do the same thing I did there, which was I went through the deck quickly, mostly because I wanted to have more conversations about all of this than just be regurgitating information at you. I found a lot of people have questions and really just want to talk about ideas and thoughts and processes because there is no... there's textbooks and everything that will tell you this is the way to do it, but real life is messy, and we all know that. And there is no absolute way to do these things. So we will be going through the benefits and limitations of user stories, use cases, what, how, and why. I talked a little bit about actors and personas because people had questions about that, and then bringing it all together. And hi, I'm Lauren Kelly. I'm a senior engagement manager at Pantheon. I'm the lead on the migrations team, which means that I get to work with some of you, bring sites over from other hosts over to Pantheon. I was, 2006 is when I started Drupaling. And I joined Pantheon 3 years ago, which was kind of actually the end of actually doing a lot of hands-on Drupal work. And I've had a lot more time to work with teams and see how they're doing projects and things like that. So this presentation came out of my experience as a Drupal developer, as a project manager, and now at Pantheon. So, what is a user story? We have things like a content editor wants to associate images with events so that the correct images are used for an event. We've kind of seen this flow before, right? As a user role, I want to do something. As a content editor, I want to associate images with events. This is an incredibly simplified user story. And this is often what you get when your team is really excited and just wants to go and do. And sadly, not something you can actually deliver on, accurately at least. So the proper form is pretty important on these. As a user role, I want to do something so that a value is provided. Answering why helps determine if and when more information is needed. So as a content editor, I want to associate images with events so that the correct images are used for any given event. Okay, that's better, but really, could you deliver on that with certainty? Could you scope this properly? Do you know what's in scope, what's out of scope? Not really. So unless standards are enforced, they can be ambiguous. Right? As a content editor, I want to associate images with events that the correct images are used for any given event. What's the real purpose of the story? Could you deliver this with 100% confidence? It's probably not. If we add more details, right? If we add in that we want to tag images with the associated event so that they can be consistently used in multiple locations on the site, reducing the chance of incorrect images for an event. This is better. The scope of the story is configuring a system of tagging images. It needs to be in a method that allows use in a variety of ways, but configuring those uses is not in scope. So doing the views for the images, not in scope. We don't care about that. What we want for this one is just the tagging. You could estimate this work. You've defined what's in scope for this work, and you could probably deliver this and know that it was going to be accepted. So user stories are important. They are a huge tool for planning, for communication, and focusing on the task at hand. Do you all use user stories now? Does anybody not use user stories? Okay.
Neither used nor not used. Lots of hand raisers.
The idea is that you can plan your sprints, if you're using sprints, whatever, but even if you're not using sprints, you can plan your work, that you know what's going to be happening, right? You need this to get your work actually done. They are very they're just English, right? Anybody could read that. And although we started getting a little technical in there with tagging and things like that, the idea of it was plain English. You could hand it off to somebody and say, is this what you were looking to be able to do? And they could read that and say, yeah, actually that is what I wanted to do. Or they could say, no, this isn't what I wanted to do. That's one of the huge benefits with these, is that they're readable. You can share them. They do get technical though, and the more technical they are, the less useful in that sense they are with stakeholders. But the other, and this was a big part for me, when I started using user stories, it was 2007 was the first project I used user stories on, and I tend to be one of those people that just like multitasks all day, and it was fantastic to just have this thing and say, this is my task, this is what I'm working on, this thing right here has to be done in this period that for us it was the day. We had to pick stories for the day, and they had to be done at the end of the day. So it helps you focus on the piece of work to be implemented, which then helps with scope creep too, obviously. Okay. So there's limitations there, though. They're meant to be selected for development and then discarded. They're not meant to be like a permanent piece of documentation for the project. And a lot of times we do use that. Most of the shops that I've worked at, most of the teams I've worked with, have used that method. You put in your user stories, you do your work, you move it into the done, and that's then the documentation of the project, of the work that was done. Which isn't how they're meant to be used. As we saw, there's different ways of writing them. If the teams aren't consistent in writing the user stories, there's going to be too much scope creep. The more excited the team is to dive in and get to work, the worse the user stories are. Which is, they want to do it. They're excited. They're ready to go. The biggest problem I've seen, though, is that it's far too easy to slip into using user stories as a checklist. This piece is done. This piece is done, move it over. This piece is done, move it over. And then in the end, you have this project that was built of all these different pieces, but none of them actually work together. There's no communication across those pieces. There was one project that I worked on where they wanted certain functionality on the front end, and that was done, and it worked, and it looked great, except for the content editors on the back end. It was such a horrible process for them to do any of the work that it wasn't a sustainable solution, even though it met the requirements for what they had wanted. So it's very easy to create a monster. You build piece by piece without looking at the system as a whole, and you just end up adding new stories here, here, here. Right on that one, it was after that work was completed, the new story got added in for make this better for the content editor. Great, okay, that's awesome. So what is that going to affect? What is that going to change? We don't know. There's no cohesive image there. And even though that's the project manager's job, is to say, hey, here's this image, without being able to share that with your team, that means you have to supervise every piece of work being done. And that's just not feasible. It's not sustainable. So when you're building to a checklist, it doesn't talk about other places of the system, and it relies on the team implementing the feature to understand how the parts interact with the whole. And developers are not reliable in that sense. I love my teams. I love developers that I've worked with. I've been a developer. I worked at an agency where the team lead was also the PM, so the developers were their own project managers. It was fantastic. No developer who is trying to focus on those pieces for delivery can also hold that whole thing in their head. And of course, I shouldn't say none. There are people who can successfully, if they're flying solo and working alone, that's great, that's one thing. But when you're working with a team, it gets more and more complicated. So there's better ways. Use cases let you look at the big picture. So if we consider each project a story, And I love XKCD, so I had to slip that in here somewhere. You know, if these are our stories, we've got all this stuff going on, people are coming in, things are happening, there's all these things, right? Imagine if you didn't know all the characters and their storylines as you were writing the story. How many times would you have to go back and rewrite entire sections every time something happened in here, right? If you add in this character that oh, he was there. Oh, I forgot he was there. You'd have to go back and rewrite, right? And you'd be looping through over and over again, redoing the same work over and over again. And that's what we want to try to avoid. So use cases provide the storylines. Who will be doing what things, when and where will they be doing those things? So can use to ensure that new work doesn't require unexpected reworking of existing work, right? So I wanted to make sure that was clear with the unexpected. Obviously, we're talking about live projects. Things are going to be happening, things are going to be changing. There's going to be change requests and new feature requests and things like that. What we don't want is a new request that comes in that breaks everything. So use cases talk about all of the actors, all the systems, and all of the teams. They're recorded in a few ways. So you can have a diagram of all the interactions between the actor and the system. And so this was one example of just somebody trying to register for events. You know, what processes do they have here? So we have the system of the website, and we have the system of the outside registration management, whatever, because they decided to do that. I don't know why. And we have the different actors. We have the site visitor, we have the content editor, we have the event coordinator, right, who could be marketing team or anything like that. And how are they interacting with these things, and what actions could they take? So this is like where you're coming through at a very, very high level and just thinking, what actions could people be taking? What things would we expect them to be doing? And then you could also move down further into a list, which is that usually it's the primary actor of who you're talking about at that particular moment, right? And what you're expecting them to do, but then also documenting alternative steps. Like, what might they do that would be slightly different, and what might they do that, like, oh my god, I can't believe this person put this data in here and this was totally not what I was expecting anybody to do, right? What mistakes might they make? And that's one of the cool things about this, is that you're not just documenting the positive paths for your people, you're also documenting the errors and the bad decisions. So here's for a specific, we have a site visitor registers for an event. And you just list out the steps, right? And again, we have the whole process in here. They go to register, they get sent to the login screen. They complete the login, it sends them back to the registration page. It verifies that they verify their contact information. They click to submit the registration, and it sends a confirmation email. Super, awesome. But what if what if the event's full? So we would have the site displays, an alternative for 5A would be that the site displays that registration is full for the event when they go to click for it. For 9A, if instead of confirming their contact information, they want to update it. So we need to document these other options for them. An actual use case can also, well, I shouldn't say actual use case. There's another level too, which is a document, which includes the primary actor, the goal, the preconditions, the postconditions, and the definition of success. Now, when you're talking about project documentation, this is, to me, like gold. This is something that you can hand off to people and have them sign off on. The other two, I'm going to scroll back up here. The diagram is super great for just high level, let's talk about this, what kind of things are you expecting. If you're meeting with a stakeholder, you could use this with a stakeholder, right? You could just review this with them and say, okay, what types of things are you expecting people to do? Is this everything? When a visitor comes in, what else would they be doing? And so you could, just basically use this with stakeholders, but it's very, very high level. Stakeholders probably wouldn't care about this. This is a little too detailed as far as they want to go. But the dev team could use this to start writing user stories. And then we have the document, which is far more formal. We have the site visitor is able to register without assistance from support. That's success. The preconditions. An event occurring in the future has been created and published. The event has open registration space available. The site visitor has an existing account on the site. So we're defining everything that we're saying, assuming all this is great and ready to go. They're going to register for the event without assistance, and after they register, number one, they show as registered, and number two, the registration for the count for the event is increased by 1. Basically just defining everything that's in scope for this process. And this this would be, if you had a question about functionality, you could work with a stakeholder with this document as well. This is something that's very readable. There's not jargon in here. It's just pure functionality. What's happening, what should happen, what's the end result. So how do we know the actors? And this is one of the questions that somebody asked before. And we talk about those actors, the primary actor who is like the site visitor is an actor. So we can discover those through the creation of personas. Fictional character, a whole life outside of your project. They have these are ideal things to have in there. Basically, you want to have a full picture. This should kind of look familiar to probably a lot of people, because this is what, I don't know about you, this is how I spent my childhood, creating these things. So creating personas for me is like, yeah, okay, I can do that. So here we have one. We have Miss Emily Johnson, who's a graduate student full-time in music education and a dog walker part-time. And her goal is to find hosting for her dog walking business website. She's excited about learning and sharing what she's learned, and so you'd expect her site to kind of be along those lines too. Her motivations, affordable options, because she's a student, ease of use, support, that there's support and that there's stability. Her frustrations, technical jargon. She's not a techie. Paying for things she doesn't need, and she has limited time for troubleshooting. She's a full-time student and part-time business owner here. And she comes from a middle-class Midwestern family. Not that it doesn't play a role in what we're talking about as far as the website, but who knows, with other things that come up and other stories that come along, the more fleshed out this is, the better your idea of what your actors will be doing is, the more fleshed out those will be. So her previous experience, her friend helped her build a website on her computer, and she's brand new to website ownership and new to hosting. So this would be like, we talk to these people every day. And it's important to understand their backgrounds and to know who you're talking to, right? So now we have a picture of the type of user coming to the site. Ideally, we would want a few examples for each persona group, right? So she's not technical. What if we also had a persona for somebody who was very technical and who was looking for advanced features and wasn't necessarily interested in the support levels, but wanted to be able to have awesome documentation and things like that and not have to stop what they're doing and just keep working. So we anonymize these personas, right, when we make the actor, right? That's known as the site visitor for our use cases, but that site visitor is actually a mix of all our personas. We're going to go through our personas when we do our use cases and come up with what actions that site visitor might take. What things might they do? This is how we get those. What do we want them to do? What might they do by mistake? And what are other things that they might want to do? We get that from having these ideas of these personas and making sure that we have the full picture there. So we can bring it all together, right? We build out the use cases. We have a complete view of the project. This is the fun part. You have detailed, deliverable user stories can be added to each use case. Right now you have the information to quickly and accurately write detailed user stories sprints can be planned better with fewer blockers. And by fewer blockers, I mean you have a whole sense of what completes a feature, right? This feature is done when all of these stories are done. We defined that in that diagram. And if we know that, then we know that there's no surprise blockers of, oh, I was waiting for somebody else to finish this piece so that I could do this piece. That doesn't happen because you have this whole diagram and documentation of what done is. The scope of the project has been thoroughly defined. And at the same time, you can reduce it easily because you have that full picture, and you can increase it easily because, again, you have that full picture. There's nothing in there to... the idea is to not interrupt existing work. If you make changes, you can see right then and there what it's going to affect. We also have an outline for the QA testing, and we have the shareable documentation for the project, for the whole project. So the QA and testing, I hate to do this, I'm sorry, I should have copied this slide. We have this. You could either turn this into BHAT testing very easily, or you could give this to your QA team and they could run through it. And they also have their alternative flows right there documented. Mm-hmm. So you already have all of that done that you can just hand off. And you don't have your developers writing the tests after they've done the work. You've got this ahead of the work being done. So it's actually that whole separation that we all want of did the developer actually deliver versus the test is always going to... Having your developers write your tests mean that they're always going to pass because they know what they did and they know what passes. This kind of gets rid of that. There are downsides. There are costs to doing this, obviously. It requires the whole team to slow down. You just closed the deal. Everybody came in, like there was the scoping, there was all this talk about the project. Everybody's really excited and ramped up and ready to go. Your rockstar developers, like, I know exactly how this is all going to get done, and everything's going to be awesome. They're ready to go. And you have to say, wait, we actually have to do all this other work first. That's a really painful part of this. It is time-consuming to do it right, and you need a system to keep all this project and product documentation together, accessible, and alive. And that's a key part of it. It does need to be alive. These documents need to be updated. Aiming for perfection on these is going to mean you will never actually start your project, right? You need to move forward. You have to stop documenting and start doing it at some point. The idea of these is not for them to be perfect, but for it to be a system of documentation that is alive and can be updated on a regular basis. If you're missing something, you add it in, you check to make sure it's not affecting other things, you update the other affected areas, you can easily adjust the upcoming sprints with the new user stories and everything, whatever needs to drop off and move to the following one, you can adjust all your sprints. And it just lets you keep being awesome and tell the whole story. And then I just had some resources. Usability.gov has actually really a lot of documentation on this process and recommendations. They're kind of very focused on their use cases. But they're good. It's a really good basis. GatherSpace, there is actually gone, but they have a couple blog posts up still, and their use case examples are great. Wikipedia actually has a ton of information on all of this, which is fantastic. I loved seeing that on there. And then there's this great book, and it is, I haven't seen if there's a more recent version. I think this is from 2009, I believe. I'm not sure if there's a newer version of it. But it's a great book on writing use cases. And that was the deck. But what I really wanted to do is talk to everybody about what problems you're seeing in your projects, why did you end up coming to this session, what questions do you have about anything like that? Anybody? Yeah.
I get tripped up because we write stories like we write the back end Drupal story and then we'll write a user story. So for splitting off, obviously I'll write for the developer so like if we're making a new content type, like what fields it should include. And then we have a user story, but then we also have the content editor's version of the story. So
right.
It's like I write a back-end Drupal story, then I'm also writing it from the content editor's perspective, and then I also have the user story. So I'm wondering, is that normal to have like 3 different versions of the
So I'm
story?
I'm sorry, I'm gonna jump back to here, because we have the different actors, and each of these, the site visitor, I mean, I use the site visitor for all the examples, but we have those stories for the content editor too. They need to be able to edit the event. They need to be able to view it and make sure it's all set. They need to be able to publish it or unpublish it, or put it into whatever validation workflow you have for publishing. And obviously, they need to be able to create things. So yeah, all of those would also.
Okay.
Yeah, each one of those would get broken out too. And again, for your testing purposes, that's critical. If you have this and you turn it into this, even for your content editors, then when your testers are coming through, they're not just testing from the front end. Your testers need to be testing from the back end too. So that's absolutely exactly it. Anybody else? Yeah.
Here's one for discussion. Curious about your thoughts on personas versus archetypes. We've heard some discussion about where personas focuses on here are the demographics and all the other characteristics of a person, as opposed to more of a functional, here's what a user is trying to do, and put those into buckets from that perspective. I've heard some debate about which one is better to go with.
I haven't done a project with archetypes. Personas work for me because it lets, at least for me, it lets me put myself in that person's shoes very easily and say, what things would they be concerned about? What questions would they have if they were looking at this page? This functionality, how would they do it? And it's so that empathy for that specific user helps me a lot. But I could see how some people get bogged down in that too.
I'd be curious if others what others are doing, or if they've run across that debate.
Has anybody used archetypes? Yeah. So there we go.
Instead of archetype, I've been thinking like prototype that has common features of all those personas.
Right.
Because just one persona could be misleading.
Right.
So
And that's what this, that's exactly what this is. When we turn all of those personas into our generic site visitor. Yeah. Which is kind of, and if you wanted to define them more, you could. The real thing is, like, if you have, you have this person, you have somebody coming into the site and you want to know what they're going to be doing. So we want to be filling this out. And this is where it kind of comes in with the personas. And one of the things you can do is like split the personas up around your team and have them all come up with a workflow that they're envisioning based on that persona and see how they differ and what functions are happening and things like that. And a lot of that then turns into these alternative workflows.
I think to some extent the way I've seen it happen for us is start off with a persona, but then it kind of turns to an archetype because you're focused on what are they doing on the site.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, yeah, exactly. That makes sense.
Could you explain a little bit more about what archetypes, how you are defining archetypes?
So it's more built around the idea of, rather than identify someone who's a specific age, what are they trying to do when they come to the site? So this group of users, this particular user is coming to register for an event. That's the function,
The
regardless
focus
of
more
whether
on
they're, regardless of whether they're 25 years old or a graduate student, or kind of leave that stuff aside and just focus on what is it they're trying to do, what's their goal, really.
Right. So more emphasis on the goal and the motivations, I guess, and less on this side of things. Yeah, and again, it's just the are you going to capture the full usage from the goals versus having the other side? And yeah, I think you definitely need to get more specific as you're moving into development. We can't develop for Emily, because that's when you end up with horrible. There was this one website that I worked on, and it was for a university, and we had to design the whole thing around. There was one professor who was very important for this department, though. One professor who was still stuck in like IE whatever at that point in time, and we had to build the entire thing around it being functional for this one person. Because he couldn't update his system. That was the biggest thing, and they're like, no, he has to be able to use the site exactly as it is, everything on his system exactly as it is in the browser. I'm like, can't he put in another browser? No, he cannot. Okay. So no, you don't want to build for Emily, but knowing who Emily is can shape the rest of those details that you come up with for that more narrow, defined user coming in with that goal. Anything else?
Actually, I have another question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned the notion of what's not mentioned specifically in the user case, and the tendency, I guess, with especially those you're building it for, to kind of have some level of expectation in their mind, and I just assumed that was going to be included. You talk about just your experience and trying to mitigate that. Because you're not putting down absolutely every possible scenario. Or
right, exactly.
Because you're not going to think of this dumb things that people can do.
Right, exactly. If only. Yeah, I mean, this is something I've always struggled with. I have a very strong perfectionism streak. I want these to be like done. I want this documentation to be as done as the project is when it's closed out, right? And it's not actually feasible. So that's definitely something that I have struggled with. Actually, I guess this is the one I wanted. So obviously when the testers come through, that's a big piece of adding in when they are going through and they're like, oh, I just clicked everything on the screen and then all this stuff happened. And you're like, well, you weren't supposed to click everything on the screen. But, the testing is important. And so I feel like the worst projects I ever worked on were the ones where they didn't want to spend time on documentation for even delivery to the end user, right, to the client. And again, this does give you that whole package of documentation that you can give to them of how does the site work, right? Because you have all of those use cases and you have all the scripts and you have everything in there. They actually have the documentation for that delivery, and they know how everything works, how it should work, and then they can come back to you if something doesn't work or if they want to change or something like that. But the testing, going through and doing the testing, which is the other part that gets skipped. That's what I was going with. Skipping documentation, skipping testing, and just saying, yeah, well, it works on my computer, right? And then delivering it and then it blows up. Testing will fill in these blanks, ideally. Hopefully your QA team is far enough away from the dev team that they don't know exactly how it should work, and they are coming in with a fresh view of it, and they are kind of, actually going to look at it and click all the things instead of just doing what they're supposed to do, which is hard to find. That's hard to do, but yeah. A lot of times as the project manager, going through and just seeing just flipping through like these will pull out a lot of, but what happens if, but what if, but what if, all right? So these are getting written, you review them with the team before, when they're about to go write the user stories, right? If you go through this with the team and they're going to write the stories and then they're going to estimate them and everything, you can start then raising the what ifs at this point too. Anything else? Yeah.
I feel like just this list of steps right here, what do you do when that starts to get completely out of control, when that starts to spin, when there are now steps off your steps, off your steps, when this starts feeling more like a flow chart rather than a list? Right,
narrow it down. Narrow the scope of the story down. The same way you, the case. The same as you do for user stories. If a user story is too broad and it could be anything, you need to just narrow it down. Sometimes you have to scrap what you have and realize this is actually 3 or 4 different things, and what is in scope for this, or so we have in here the verifies the contact information, and we have the updates contact information. Well, I didn't go in here and say, the whole process for that, because that would be updating contact information would be a whole different thing. Yeah. Is anybody actually using use cases now? Are you doing any of this kind of documentation for your projects? Have you found it helps a lot?
Yeah, we call it sort of a functional spec, because then it also gives the ultimate stakeholder the ability to understand it. Because otherwise, anything that's of a technical spec nature, then it's just gloss over.
Right. Exactly. Another thing, and I left it off the slides, and I forgot to add it in, is that these very intentionally do not include design details. We're not talking about design on here at all. This is all about functionality. This is, if you want, you could build wireframes off of all of this, and you could do your design work off of this. But we don't care about the design in this. We want to make sure that we have the functionality, so it's functionality over design. And again, I've done projects where it's design over functionality. We probably all have. This gets rid of that as an option. This ensures that you're going to have a piece that's, and again, like you were saying, the stakeholders, being able to give it to the stakeholders and say, this is it. This is you're signing off on this. This whole thing here, the whole package that we're talking about, is a deliverable to your stakeholders. And you can say, okay, do you accept this delivery? Are there modifications? Do we need to go back and change anything? This is the time to do that, because going back and making changes is expensive. This cuts down on all of that. The difference is night and day. At least it has been for me. I hate slowing down. I'm the worst at that. I hate slowing down. I just want to go. I want to dive in. Forcing myself to slow down, forcing myself to document the processes and have the conversations means the entire project goes so much better. And that when you do start, you actually know what you're doing, and you're not just brainstorming as you go. The brainstorming's been done. You can actually sit down and get to work. The team can work knowing what's expected of them. They know their sprints. One of my friends right now is working for a software company, and their sprints are, they're planning their sprints out. However, they're not meeting their sprint deliverables, which means their sprint planning is off right there. And so they have stuff carrying over from sprint to sprint, and they're just getting further and further behind. And nobody knows what their actual priorities are. this kind of helps shape all of that. You actually know, again, it's that whole what is done, what is this act, what are we actually delivering, and if the change comes through, you can document that change order, the change request, toss it in there, and say, okay, look at how that changed everything. Here we go. We have everything in here to be able to see that whole vision and tell, again, it's that whole story concept, and it's the being able to have. I loved this. This was great. Sorry, it's way up here. It's being able to have the Lord of the Rings versus Primer. It's being able to have that excitement and have everything going on and having these major events and things working and all the crazy stuff happening, and it all works out, and that's what we want. Yeah.
This is a multi-part question, I guess.
Uh,
So, for instance, if you're planning moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and so there's that.
Yeah.
And then you're also adding new features. So, for instance, you have a reservation system, and it's clunky, but you're planning on getting new ones when you move to 8. And your users are vast. It's not just one type of user. It's seniors, it's young people.
Right.
so on.
Yeah.
So, I guess my question is, part of it is, how do you prioritize in terms of developing user experience?
It really.
And all the actors, because it varies so much.
I like this diagramming for that kind of determining priorities, because if you have this of what our number one, if you're starting this at here's this process that I have this registration process or reservation process, here's everything that needs to happen with it. And again, we're not talking about the upgrade specifically in here, but we're talking about the functionality that needs to be in place at the end, right? And from here you could easily prioritize what's the most important things. Which pieces are for MVP, right? Which of these stories are MVP? And you could highlight those and then just determine from those. And you could see what's missing instead of it being like, here's my MVP, and then you realize this major part of it is missing. And then once you have that functionality done, then you can kind of do your mapping for the upgrade. At least that's probably what I would do with it. I'm really big on just I like having visibility, that transparency of the whole project. I hate having to stop what I'm doing and ask questions. That's always, developer, I hated stopping what I was doing, asking questions. I just wanted to keep going. If I need to look it up, that's one thing. If I need to go back to the documentation, if I need to go do whatever, as a developer, that's fine. I don't mind. That's, I don't want to have to stop what I'm doing and go ask somebody a question. So having this transparency of everything being available is a fantastic thing. Yeah.
So who is the person in the team in charge of the user case things? Is the content strategist or the project manager?
I would think they would coordinate together.
Okay.
Because the project manager needs to understand, they're a piece of it, right? The content managers are a piece of it, but they don't have the whole picture either. They don't have marketing's point of view, right? They don't have necessarily the business side's point of view. So you need, as the project manager, you need to pull all those pieces in. But I think that would be a lot of communication there, a lot of coordination. And you absolutely do need, you can't, if you had a whole PM team, yes, your PM team could just handle all of this. I've never actually had a project where I had an entire team working for me. You have to delegate. You have to have somebody you can say, okay, you are the representative for your team. I need you to help create these stories. And it's not a just send them off on their own and tell them to go do it. It's still a partnership between you and them, but you need to be able to delegate and let them do work too, because otherwise you would really never get anything done.
Once they got this information, how they deliver to the designer, how the designer takes their information from here to help with the design process.
Yeah, so again, going back to this view, or even this one, right? I think probably this section of it would be better to hand to the designer because they can kind of see what's going on. Ideally, they would have their wireframes, kind of a basic wireframe already started, and they would say, okay, well, we know they're going to come to the home page, and they're going to see upcoming events. Well, let's figure out the prominence of that. Where is that going to be on there? They're going to see, desired events like so we already specified there that they're going to click on a desired event. So we know that we kind of want to have that view have individual events and things like that. So you could, as a designer, go through this and say, like, oh, I can picture this. I can picture how this is going to be. Here, let me do this wireframe and, see how that looks for you. And then as they're going through these and they're adding more and more functionality, they're going to be shifting and moving things and making it the whole picture for that page or whatever. But again, they have all the information they need to be able to do that with no surprises. They're not going to get to the end. They're not going to do this whole design, hand it off to the team, and then find out that there's whole new functionality that nobody knew about that they have to now fit in on this page. That's this beautiful page that they spent weeks working on, and now they have to change the whole thing, and then you have an angry designer.
I think the project I did, we don't have this stack things, but what we did is we made the wireframe and then we did like user testing, so just see how the amendments.
Yeah. Were you gonna?
No, I was just going to say, I think that kind of raises the question of like a chicken or an egg scenario. And you said that there is a design in the stage, but there needs to be some layer design in terms of whether it's system design or ideation. Because this list, maybe a designer can take a look at it and come up with some innovative idea that would, maybe change the way they approach composing this list.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
also in your example of the user story, someone did design by saying we should use tags to have the system work more efficiently. And so, one of my frustrations when I've been in the role of project manager is who is the person who sees the whole as you're starting to build that? Before you have something that's a whole that you can kind of describe, how do you build the whole without seeing it? And being in that position where you feel somewhat powerless.
I'm a huge proponent of mock-ups and wireframes and getting those started as early as you can. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I wouldn't wait for, I wouldn't exclude design from the conversations. And I wouldn't hold up work on wireframes, mock-ups, and things like that.
Right, but even in that scenario, at least this is my experience. This may be totally not everyone else's, but in my experience, a site architect is so critical to this entire process because the site architect can say, "Let's not do that because Drupal doesn't want you to do it that way," or whatever.
Yeah. No, you have to have. Absolutely, yeah. You have to have somebody on the team who's saying, Drupal, actually, let's do this. Instead of having so that's the other kind of monster you can create, right? There's the monster, the Frankenstein monster of doing it piecemeal. And then there's the other one of, well, Drupal will let you do everything. The best thing that I ever, my Drupal mentor, I love him. The first Drupal project I worked on, he was one of those great guys who was like, come here, you gotta see this cool thing I did. And I love working with people like that. But what he always said to me was, it's not can you do it in Drupal? It's should I do it in Drupal? And yeah, you have to have somebody along for the ride for all of this to say, that's great that you said that we're logging them in, great, and we're sending them to the registration page and everything, but back up here, this is using an outside registration manager, right? So we because of the information that we're collecting, we don't want to keep, and where we're doing our hosting, we don't want that information in Drupal. It needs to be somewhere else. And somebody has to be there to say all of that.
And as projects scale and they get bigger, those questions get.
Yeah. And again, so these have to be live documents, and that's the idea then of the systems being broken out on these diagrams, of being able to say, actually, no, we need to break that out for these reasons or whatever. And so yeah, you can't do a successful project in a silo. There has to be communication. There's always, that's the I think one of the, forget all of this as far as pain points go. If your team can't talk with everybody else, if there can't be cross-team communication, it's gonna fall apart. Those are the ones where everybody wants to kill the project manager because they have no clue what's going on and how can they manage this project because they're so out of touch with everything, and nobody knows what anybody else is doing. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like, how do you overcome objections to users being involved in this process, like the time commitment? And sometimes people are like, well, can't you just build something and let me know, and I'll tell you if you're on the right track. Because I get a lot of that.
I got a lot of that too. Yeah, I think we've all got a lot of that. Say no. Or get them to sign off on, smaller deliverables. It really, I mean, if they're, one of the shops I worked for had a insanely discounted website offering of, you came in for a 2-hour meeting, did a brain dump, we built a site for you, we delivered it. There's no communication between there. After that kickoff and delivery, there's no communication. Delivery was, here's your site, it's ready to go, we're going to flip the switch, here's your documentation on it, and you're done, you're all set. Here's how you use it. They knew that going into it, and they signed off on it, and I want to say about 90% of them were successful, and the ones that weren't were disastrous. I think as soon as you start talking to a stakeholder, and if they're that kind of high need stakeholder, this is their baby, you better take care of their baby, this is their entire focus, their entire life is around this being successful, you would never want to do that. You would just be like, no, I can't actually do that because this is too important. This is important to you, this is important to me. I want us to work on this together, and if they don't have time, then it's not that important. But yeah, I don't miss that. I could see, if you had somebody who was really, if you had stakeholders who were really, really hard to get time with, you could just work on this level with them, and say, hey, this is the functionality we're looking at. You don't worry about the systems, like you don't care about that, where they're going or whatever, but just, are these the things you're expecting them to be able to do? Is there anything else that we missed? And if you can get them to sign off on this at least, give you something, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anything else? I think we're just about out of time. All right. And again, I apologize for not being a morning person.
You're great.
Thank you.